you.
Thanks, Richard. Can you all hear me? Give me some positive feedback there. Thank you very much. Okay, so the title now has taken on a whole new meaning for me because I feel like I'm falling down a black hole. There's so many ideas going on in the chat. Please stop with the chat while I'm talking because I will not be able to concentrate on what I have to say. So I'm gonna talk to you about some work I've been doing now for the best part of 4 years on the side. It's a bit of a side hustle to my day job. My day job is, well, now it's Professor of Learning and Teaching at Teeside University. I wasn't always Professor of Learning and Teaching, but I've been at Teeside for the last 4 years. But I've always had an interest in creativity in higher education, creative learning and teaching. I'm a coach by trade, so I come at things from a very performative kind of angle. So all of the chat on the side here has been really interesting to me. So I want to talk to you about some work that I've developed, and I want to share with you some initial thoughts on what's come out of that. So the work's actually started in 2019. It straddled the online abyss of COVID-19 and has continued into the return to face-to-face wonderfulness over the last kind of year and a bit. So next slide, please. Beautiful. I'm also I like to be in control, as Petya well knows. And the fact that I can't click my own slides forward is starting to give me a bit of anxiety, but we'll try and get through that. Okay, this is the problem statement that I was fascinated with. I did a lot of work and have done a lot of work in creativity. If we accept that creativity is a fundamentally human characteristic, it's essential to our own well-being and productivity, why is it that creativity continues to be undervalued in everyday teacher practice? And I'm not necessarily undervalued from a subjective sense, although we'll get into that, but more in terms of the environments that we're operating within. And I think there's so much crossover here. It's why I love going last. Okay, so I can just draw on everybody else's ideas and profess that they're my own. So we're going to draw on some. I'm going to try and click into as much of this as I can, bring and draw through some of the previous talks as well. Improvisation makes an appearance. So, you know, there's performance, there's all sorts. Okay, so not to ruin it for you, but that's my problem statement. That's what this whole work was looking to dwell on and get a bit deeper into. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, please. Okay, so much of today's the educator's role in higher education is focusing on objective performance, maintaining high standards and levels of achievement, and comparatively little attention has been given to the role of creativity in our own professional learning strategies. And that's really what I wanted to get into here. And this plugged me into the whole discourse around, well, there's obviously there's so much literature on creativity, learning and teaching, education, but specifically kind of focused down on here the work around everyday creativity, particularly Mark Runko's work, you know, and how creativity is an actual fact, an everyday phenomenon. You know, in truth, we know very little about the mechanisms underlying everyday creative behaviours in the context of professional practice in higher education. We just don't. You know, Norman Jackson's work around creativity and creative ecologies, and there's loads out there. But in terms of taking a deep dive on the lived experience of everyday creativity, I've not been able to find too much that kind of hooks into this. So, and Runko talks about the idea of personal creativity. So day to day, it's our personal creativity that gets us through situations. So whether they be new, unfamiliar, challenging, or the like. Okay, so that's kind of where I'm coming from. There's so much more literature. I had about 55 slides around literature, but I took them all out, and this is really the one that I wanted to just kind of have you dwell on for a moment. Okay, next slide, please. So what did the work look like then? So I'm interested. We've got this problem statement. How did I go about coming to some form of response to that? So initially, didn't start out as a research project as such. It was more of productive inquiry. You know, I knew something was there. All the literature seems to suggest that there is, but I couldn't find anything really of substance that really got me to where I wanted to get to. So I was running a series of working with creativity practice-based workshops. And as I say, these were done by invitation or by offer around the sector. And I ran 6 of these, so it could be with 30 colleagues, could be with 50 colleagues, but most of these happened face-to-face on campuses. 2 of them happened online, which has been an interesting experience and can be done, as has already been professed today. But it was through doing these workshops that I really realized that there was something behind all of this I needed to spend a bit more time with. So I invited colleagues taking part in those 6 workshops to participate in what essentially became an interpretive phenomenological analysis project. So long form conversations around a concept board containing 2 open questions around creativity and practice. So anybody unfamiliar with IPA, it's fundamentally about phenomenological research. I'm not going to go into too much in the weeds around this. There's plenty there. PhD was on that many years ago, and it's kind of how I roll in terms of research. But it's an ideographic approach. It's about the lived experience and understanding what the meaning of that particular experience is for the people having the experiences. So it's a deep dive. It's qualitative in nature, and I'm going to go through with you some of the insights gleaned from taking that particular approach with my participants. So there's 21 in total. We won't get through all of the comments, obviously. Phenomenological research is inherently rich and qualitative, but I'm going to try and give you some highlights. Okay, so next slide, please. So the first question then, and what I want you to do when we're working through this is, if do you fancy having a go at this yourselves? Do you fancy trying to put a response of this in to this in the chat? Please do. Please feel free. It's free research on my part, but I'm just genuinely interested in what your response would be and seeing whether there's any similarities what came back from participants. So what role does creativity play in your day-to-day work practices? Now, you're probably all sat there. In fact, I've seen a change in people's facial expressions already in terms of, well, I can probably guess what's going to come out here. And it was a particularly interesting response in general terms. If you go to the next slide, please. So every day, turns out, and again, this might be common sense to a lot of you, but in terms of the lived experience, we don't really know a lot about this. So everyday creativity can be supported and nurtured, as well as weakened and suffocated by the climate for learning and practice created through our working environments and conditions. So this is revealed in the data as constraining and liberating factors. These are the themes that came out. So in terms of constraining factors, you'll be familiar if you're thinking about things in your own kind of settings and work roles, the structural impediments that might be in place, the organizational structures, the processes, the parameters of your role, perhaps maybe holding you back, as the participant 7 is outlining there. The cultural expectations, so the normative behaviours expected from us as practitioners in higher education, and the sub-discipline expectations as well. So obviously we're not just talking about general higher educationalists, we're talking about people with disciplinary affiliation, and that in itself can be quite constraining. The tolerance or lack of tolerance for risk taking already come up today, and the fact that the value proposition of creativity is actually held out as an objective external thing, something that has value outside of the individual. So it's an exchange value, which was quite interesting as well. So it's actually out of touch most of the time for a lot of people. Next slide, please. Then we have the liberating factors, and this is where we see so many crossovers of what's already been discussed today. So trusting environments, trust came up in Anna's talk. Trusting environments, trusting relationships played out in working within communities of practice. So how those trust relationships play out, and the power dynamic shift in terms of being more democratic. But also, more importantly, the value proposition, or at least the locus of value proposition, shifts to an internal one. So it's the subjective internal experience and value of creativity is valued and is made space for and time for in how we operate day to day. Next slide, please. Obviously, I'm whizzing through this. There's a lot more behind all of this, but we only have 10 minutes. And I was jesting at the start that Petya Petrova has never spoken for 10 minutes in her life. I can categorically tell neither have I. So the next open-ended question on our concept board: when do you feel at your most creative in practice? One was trying to situate the practice. One's trying to get to really at that lived experience. So I'm really interested in your thoughts here as well. When do you feel at your most creative in your practice? Next slide, please. And this is where things really did get into some really interesting areas. So the first kind of overarching theme here was personal flexibility. And as you can see here, a couple of nuances here, but Actually, there's a lot of crossover as well. I'm sorry, I'm thinking about what's gone before and trying to weave it into what I'm talking about here. But this was evidence to the application of individual evaluative judgment, being able to work through the situation moment by moment in response to unpredictable situations that require the self-awareness and relative confidence to embrace and navigate change, and the capacity to put learning to work in a variety of different ways and settings. Okay, remember, this is the lived experience. This is about moment to moment experience and how creativity comes to the fore as a way of negotiating that. Next slide, please. Resilience, again, something that is inherently interrelated in the discourse around creativity, with the creative acts and the creative process. This is evidenced through self-regulated, adaptable and collaborative behavior, all behaviors that have been highlighted already today, in response to overcoming obstacles, dealing with uncertain situations and outcomes, requiring a tolerance for ambiguity, a positive motivational outlook, and a proclivity for problem solving. So resilience, not just dealing with the bad stuff, but in the lived moment, in the lived experience of everyday creativity, it's actually quite a positive thing, which I found really, really interesting. Again, no time at all to dwell on it. Moving on. I'm going to move on to the next theme: openness and curiosity. So the ability to reframe challenge, finding balance between ability, perceived challenge, and situation and task. Now, Petty's already taken the mick out of me in the chat about going on about flow and flow theory. I've written a lot about flow theory in other areas. So flow theory, being in the flow, being in the zone, all that we've heard all of that before. But this was a little bit different. This was about recognizing that, okay, the challenge of this particular situation is quite high for my perceived ability. How do I reframe the challenge so I can maintain a balance and actually achieve mastery in something, as opposed to be over challenged? So in response to situations and tasks that require the ability to elicit, analyze, refine, and evaluate existing knowledge, and an openness to new and different ideas and perspectives, helps us with that rebalancing and reframing. Next slide, please. Proactivity, and I've put, luckily for me, I've put in brackets improvisation, because obviously it's come up already today. Well, I cheated, I knew what was coming, because obviously me and Betty know each other, but the it wasn't improvisation in the strictest possible sense, but there was a proactivity to, which I think, is inherent within the improvisation idea. But what we're talking about here, it's evidence, these kind of experiences, evidence in the self-initiated and anticipatory behaviors day to day and moment to moment, in response to scenarios and tasks that require a capacity to take measured risk. How dare we? An ability to perceive and create new opportunities for action, and a resourcefulness to pursue novel ideas and challenges, even though we're faced with uncertainty. So actually that proactivity, again, very positive in its inclination there. Next slide, please. I'm whizzing through this, doing no justice at all to the words of my participants, but you get the idea. Okay, we're nearly there, we're nearly there, we're nearly there. Okay, so the lived experience of the participants through what we've just outlined illustrated that everyday creativity as it's lived is more than an occasional reprieve. It just happens upon us. Actually, there's some key characteristics here. Participants' experience revealed three core characteristics of everyday creativity. There was a hook, an intentional focus, something that we found inherently appealing and interesting. There was a fit between the opportunities for personal action and our ability then to be able to do something with those opportunities. And perhaps more importantly, a sense of plausibility. So our ability to actually feel like we have a degree of control in order to do something with that, with those opportunities and with the action to sustain a certain quality of experience. Next slide, please. So this is my very early kind of attempt at a definition of everyday creative practice in the absence of one at the start of the process. An individual's dynamic acquaintance with a set of behaviors, not directly related to any specific activity, but rather to an individual's ability to generate, understand, and act upon new ideas, bring about personal change that enriches their day-to-day practice. It's a line in the sand based on the work that we've done. So that's there. Happy to take thoughts on that. Happy to gain feedback on that. Well, next slide, please. And finally, what this is for me through this process, what this has done is helped us unpack the idea of everyday creative practice as a praxis. So everyday creativity is situated in personal models, They're developed over time. They're incremental aggregations of creative acts day to day. There's no guarantees, as we've already had the discussion in the chat. But what they do require, or they are predicated on, are they grounded in intersubjective experience. They're not something we can preordain or attach different meanings from external to us. It requires reflection of action. It's intentional. It also about bringing to bear our personal resources onto everyday situations. That intentionality, the way that we make sense of those day-to-day interactions. And actually, most interestingly for me, it appears to be at the core of our everyday coping, and what Antonovsky termed as a sense of coherence, a dynamic feeling of confidence that our internal and external environments are A, comprehensible, B, manageable, and C, meaningful enough that we have resource available to meet the demands of our immediate situations, and that these demands are intrinsically appealing enough for us to evoke personal effort and engagement. Otherwise, why bother? Final slide, just as a final parting thought. So this is Maggie Bowden's work, actually 2004, quite some time ago, but I think this works. So actually, when we're talking about everyday creativity, we're not talking about thinking outside the box. It's about new boxes. The balance, the challenge is to redefine the box for ourselves as we're living through these interactions, establish new rules and boundaries based on what we can do, within which creative ideas and practices can be shaped and developed. So I shall leave you with that thought, folks. Thank you very much for your patience.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. Again, lots more applause. So we've got 3 or 4 minutes for some questions and discussion. Perhaps one to kick us off. Do you want to say a bit more about the kind of link between flow and expertise and kind of ground it in there?
Yeah, okay. No, I don't, because I'll be here until next week. Okay, so flow predicated on a number of different conditions. Petty's laughing at me now. I can't possibly concentrate and give you a straight answer, but the idea is very much, I see it, the easiest way I've come to describe it is a bit like a scale, right? It's predicated on finding a balance between perceived challenge and perceived skill, right? So the challenges need to be understandable and achievable. They need to make sense, but also the skill level needs to be not in our comfort zone, because that doesn't move us forward, but actually within reach, so as not to overstretch it. So there's a great diagram which I had in the original talk and stripped it out. So apologies, I wouldn't have to do this if it was a slightly longer talk. But where we find that challenges outweigh our perceived skills, we tend to experience anxiety, and potentially the quality of our work goes down. Yeah, and then you can understand how that works. And then where there's perhaps our challenge, we've done this before, we're very skilled in this area, and the challenge is way below what we've done before. Well, that can lead to apathy and boredom. So it really is about finding that balance. And I found it really interesting that actually what a lot of the participants were doing was about negotiating that balance, reframing what they were faced with day to day in order to find a more that equilibrium between skill and challenge in order to be able to do something, worth doing. So yeah, there's a lot more to it, but in terms of the context of what I'm talking about here, that's the most relevant response for me.
Brilliant, thank you. And then there's a bit of discussion back and forth about the concept, I guess, of or the value of unpreparedness in teaching practice. And I guess linking back to the stuff before about risk taking and the extent to which institutional culture encourages that or not. You've got any thoughts on, I guess, what you've said, but also the other talks today, how the kinds of things that we're discussing today can actually be used as more of a bottom-up approach rather than top-down leaders saying, yeah, you can take risk and do different things in teaching. How can we kind of shift it around so that people like us actually create courses and things like in the improv course that Petter spoke about, things you're talking about as well, that these kind of things kind of move up through the system to make an institution more risk-taking?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one and needs a far longer answer than I'm going to be able to give you. But I think the key thing for me is, what are we modeling for? Yeah, so that's the question I ask all the time. What are we modeling for in the way that we set our organizational governance systems and processes up? How we encourage our academic staff to operate within those structures. Yeah, because very often it doesn't matter what we do in terms of giving people permission. A lot of the times it came across here, you know, the constraining and the liberating factors. And, you know, there was no surprises in the constraining factors, i.e. structure, culture, all of those things. And obviously any of those things, to change any of those things is massively problematic and a huge effort. But for me, it's a question, what are we modeling for? What do we want to model for? Do we want to model for learning development, or do we want to model for learning or knowledge acquisition? I think there's a bit of a tension there, but I do think I like that bottom-up approach. I think there's an element of the idea of setting the scene for the kinds of learning that we want to encourage, and having an idea of what forms that might take, but not being overly prescriptive in how that's going to happen. Of course, that's flying in the face of 500 years worth of higher education, when we've got to write our learning outcomes and we've got to have this and we've got to have that. But I do think we back ourselves into a corner at the point of design a lot of the time, where we're trying to preordain a lot of the learning that we want to see. And we probably know this, but don't think we know of it, but not think about it. I mean, it's already come up in the chat. You know, learning as it's lived is inherently subjective and largely unpredictable. So why are we backing ourselves into a corner and trying to draw a box around things, hence the new box? So I think there's an element of creating an environment and allowing, and I love the fact that Anna brought this up earlier on. You know, the big thing for me, certainly my interactions with staff here at Teeside, is trust. Trust me to do this, and don't make me feel like I have to, you know, do this by numbers. Trust my professional judgment. Allow me to figure this out in the moment. I think that, so question, I think in my response would be, what are we modeling for and what do we want to model for?